it, but special what?
Drawing.
It's not in the data, is it? No. So then they can't do it.
But you think they can't do it otherwise also. IMF is an advisory.
We don't care about that.
What is it? Game of Thrones?
Do that, make it fun. All of you learn like your respective language.
What?
You didn't know what IMF for like China.
Create monetary policy.
You can score better than 5 lakhs. We can bet only like
What you say? Let's go.
Marx for shooting.
Rather.
You're almost there. You should go on like that. Young Sheldon's
You are laughing.
No, all you see made from Naga Cup, wearing Naga. Get to Naga again.
Is your family split?
Hello everyone. Sorry if we are late. So, I'm happy to say that we have the Dean of the Journalism School, Tom Goldstein. Please sit down. So we have Dr. Ganguly, although he never uses his title, to speak to us on what I suspect will be an amusing and provocative subject, Mahabharata over Marx and the Indo-Pakistan relationship. Swagato, by virtue of brief introduction, is both an engineer from the elite IITs of India,
That was long ago.
and he has a PhD from an elite American university, one that is long reputed for specializing in South Asia, which is Pennsylvania. And so you can ask him questions not just about his talk, but also on the thing that we've been talking about method and positivism and post-positivism. I'm sure he'll have something to say about it. But I always believe that apart from the official information about the speaker, one should get to know a little bit about the speaker. And what I can say from my long experience of knowing him is that, unlike most journalists, this is a man who shuns publicity. Journalists are very useful and helpful and all of that, but often one finds that journalists also like the oxygen of publicity. But Mr. Ganguly, Dr. Ganguly, breaks that mold.
I'm
So
actually half academic, half journalist.
Exactly, there you go. But so please, where would you? I mean, you can sit
sit
or
and
stand.
come?
Yes, of course. And if this is in your eyes, then you can move it a bit either way. Do you need a speaker?
आपको पता है?
Huh? No, I think it's not in your eyes, right? No, that's fine. There is God. Just saves you from yelling. I think
What
everyone
is-
will move it. Oh, for the video.
Okay, I wanted to talk about the India-Pakistan relationship from 1990, when the roughly when the Kashmir insurgency exploded, until the present. And this has been a fairly troubled phase, except for a short, perhaps a short interlude from 2004 onwards, after the Islamabad declaration that was signed between India and Pakistan. General Musharraf and the Indian government, which resulted in a brief interlude, which was a relatively peaceful period. And during that interlude, I better switch my phone off. Keeps, during that interlude, what seems impossible today might actually have come close to being achieved, because there were detailed talks between India and Pakistan, which settled almost all issues between India and Pakistan, including Kashmir. But the Musharraf regime was deposed, and nothing really happened. What happened after that was the Mumbai attacks of 26/11, which threw everything off track again. But one could argue that the whole relation from 1947 onwards, not just 1990, the relationship has been mostly a troubled one, with perhaps relative interludes of relative harmony. And the big question on India-Pakistan relationship is whether India and Pakistan are destined to fight. This is a book that was published last year, called which I edited, called "Destined to Fight?" ? It's basically a collection of essays published in Times of India, articles published in Times of India on the India-Pakistan relationship from 1990 to 2017. which I selected, which might be good for your library. If you know,
Yes,
I think it's fairly useful for people studying.
Yes, we'll
It's
put
a,
it in some
and it has some very revealing essays by people who were in the know of. For instance, one by P.N. Dhar, who was Indira Gandhi's secretary during the when the Shimla Accord was signed between India and Pakistan, 1972. And he tells us what went on behind the scenes, as it were. And I invoke the Mahabharata in my title because the Mahabharata is an epic vision of undying enmities, often among people who are closely related. Whereas Marx's vision of history is one that is much more dynamic, one that moves towards progress. Moreover, it's one where the economic base determines the political superstructure, where economics is the base. And many proponents of peace between India and Pakistan have argued that for economic reasons, India and Pakistan should really make peace because they have common problems of poverty and underdevelopment. So instead of wasting their resources fighting each other, why don't they pool their resources and reap a peace dividend, as it were, which seems to make sense from a rational perspective. But what if one is invested in a sort of blood feud, as it were, as in the Mahabharata, and one cannot really move on. One cannot really move on from the legacy of the, let's say, the partition, 1947 partition, and that would be a more sort of static view of history. But I'm going to quote famous opening lines from Karl Marx's one of Karl Marx's books called The 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, where even Marx seems to come close to a Mahabharat-like vision. And those lines go like this: "The tradition of all the dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living. And just when they seem engaged in revolutionizing themselves and things, in creating something that has never existed, precisely in such moments of revolutionary crisis, they anxiously conjure up the spirits of the past to their service and borrow from them names, battle cries, and costumes in order to present the new scene of world history in time-honored disguise and this borrowed language." So in Marx's language too, you see the struggle between the old and the new. The new trying to burst through the kernel of the old, as it were, but often failing. It's because it is often contained in the new, the idiom of the old. It cannot discover new language for itself. And if I can quote some more famous, perhaps even more famous opening lines, these are from Salman Rushdie's novel Midnight's Children. These lines record the birth of Salim Sinai, who's the central protagonist of Midnight's Children and who's kind of an uncertain narrator. Uncertain narrator because his narrative kind of fuses history and fable, fuses real history and fable in a way that makes it kind of difficult to separate the two. The opening lines of Midnight's Children go: "Clock hands joined palms in respectful greeting as I came. Thanks to the occult tyrannies of those blandly saluting clocks, I had been mysteriously handcuffed to history. There was to be no escape. I was left with no say in the matter. I had become heavily embroiled in fate. Now, Salim Sinai is born at the stroke of midnight. Those who would have read the novel know, 15 August 1947. And that was the hour when Jawaharlal Nehru delivered his famous Tryst with Destiny speech, which I think most of you know. It's sort of envisioning a leap beyond the subcontinent's current history of poverty and conflict into a sort of different, better future. So in that sense, it's an optimistic speech. It's kind of like Karl Marx's vision of history today. It looks towards progress. But at the same time, we know what the flip side of that moment was. 15 August 1947. It was partition and the violence that accompanied it. 1 million people dead, 14 million displaced. It was kind of our Indian subcontinent's equivalent of the Holocaust in Europe. So 1947 gave rise to a sort of alternate, darker inheritance as well. And it is perhaps that darker inheritance that Salim Sinai is invoking when he talks about the dead weight of history, which is a bit like the Karl Marx quote from Louis Bonaparte, 18 Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte as well. So in India's case, you might see a kind of in the Indian subcontinent's case, you might see a sort of inversion of what Marx believed in, because politics becomes the base, as it were. So politics in terms of the differences between India and Pakistan, Kashmir, secularism, religion, which then gets to determine the economic superstructure, which is the lack of trade between India and Pakistan, when trade would be so very beneficial to both. And even one could argue the state of poverty and underdevelopment of both countries. Many people have made that argument. And many people have made the, as I just mentioned before, that both countries are better off pooling their resources. Even Prime Minister Modi made that argument, I think in one of his speeches from Red Fort, where he said that we should battle, the two nations should engage in a war on poverty rather than war against each other. So that idea has been around for a while, and Hussein Haqqani, who was the Pakistani ambassador to the US and Sri Lanka and currently lives in the US, has written a book recently called India and Pakistan, India versus Pakistan. Why can't we be just friends? So again, his book suggests a different view of the relationship. And in fact, the book recounts a conversation between Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who was then the Governor General of Pakistan, and the US Ambassador to Pakistan, a gentleman named Paul Olling. And Jinnah tells Olling that he envisaged relations between India and Pakistan similar to that between the United States and Canada. And he even envisaged that after he retired from his post of Governor General, he would return to Bombay, where he owned a house, and he would retire in Bombay. I find this quite fantastic because Jinnah may have engineered the partition, but he apparently had no, he had very little clue about what partition, the legacy of partition was or meant. But also, I mean, it is a thought worth holding on to, because just like Americans and Canadians, Indians and Pakistanis are, they speak similar languages, their origins lie within the same subcontinental culture. As neighbors, they could compare with the US and Canada. In fact, Indians and Pakistanis get along famously if they are in the United States or Canada. I was in the United States during much of the 1990s, and I had very good Pakistani friends. In fact, I mean, you can leave aside the United States and Canada. Even when Indians go to Pakistan, they experience, I mean, this is anecdotal, but one has heard this anecdote too often, these anecdotes too often to, there might be something behind it as well. You know, Indians experience extraordinary hospitality when they go to Pakistan, very contrary to what they might expect. And given the official hostile state of relations between India and Pakistan, this is a conundrum worth exploring, why that happens. I once met Asma Jahangir, who's sort of this, who's a human rights, who upheld human rights, and who's a legend in that sense in terms of upholding human rights in a place like Pakistan. And she told me that this was a time when Bollywood films were banned in Pakistan, but she told me that every Pakistani family watches smuggled Bollywood films on DVDs or whatever. So apart from India, Bollywood's biggest fans may be in Pakistan. How am I doing for time? How much?
We have another 15 minutes.
So, Hussain Haqqani, in his book, he recounts another episode, which I think is also a metaphor for how easily things can flip both ways in the India-Pakistan relationship. He was looking for the records of negotiations which were carried out between India and Pakistan during the Musharraf government. The Indian negotiator was Satinder Lamba, and his Pakistani interlocutor was Tariq Aziz, and they had sort of extended negotiations empowered by both their governments to sort of negotiate a peace deal which would settle all existing issues between India and Pakistan. This was after Musharraf's downfall. So he wanted to look at the records of what negotiations had taken place. He went to the Pakistani Foreign Office. They told him they had no records, and he should instead speak to General Kyani. Kyani was then the head of the army. There was a civilian government, and Kyani was the head of the army. And as we know, the army is an all-powerful institution in Pakistan. And Kyani simply told him there are no records and negotiations should begin afresh. So I find this fascinating too, that the extended negotiations had taken place, but it all seemed to depend on one man on the Pakistani side, Musharraf, and there's no institutional memory as such. And Kyani indicated that negotiations should start from scratch once again. It's quite possible that they may not have wanted to give Haqqani might have not been in hock with the authorities at that point, and they may not have wanted to release the records to him. But nevertheless, we know that soon after that, what happened was 26/11, which the Pakistanis initially denied that they were involved in, but initially the evidence was so overwhelming that they too had to admit that there was a Pakistani role there, and which of course destroyed all the work done by the negotiators. So if one wants a chronological account of what happened since 1990, in 1990 the Kashmir insurgency played out through the 1990s more or less. By the end of the 1990s, it was defeated more or less, but it has smoldered on since. In 1998, in May 1998, both India and Pakistan conducted nuclear tests, and that qualitatively changed the situation, because soon after that the Kargil war took place, and the Pakistanis seemed to be convinced that they had acquired immunity against any Indian counterattack if, let's say, the Pakistanis carried on subconventional warfare against India, which could even translate into sort of overt incursions across the LOC like Kargil. They were largely right in that assumption too, because the Indian response was restrained. The Indian response was confined to pushing the Pakistani intruders out of the Kargil heights that they had occupied. But contrary to, let's say, the 1965 war, when Pakistani attacks were followed by large-scale Indian attacks into Pakistani territory as well. Nothing of the sort happened in 1990. And India won a lot of plaudits for its restraint as well, because this was an unprecedented situation where two nuclear-armed countries were fighting, and so it attracted world attention, perhaps much more than 1965 or 1971. And actually, it's interesting, because if one looks at the chronology of wars between India and Pakistan, first there was 1948, immediately after independence, over Kashmir. Then 1965, 1971, and 1999. That's the chronology. In the 1948 war, it was actually restrained, because both Indian and Pakistani troops were commanded by British commanders, and Lord Mountbatten was the Governor General of India in that situation. He was a member of the Defence Committee. So one must remember that this was the immediate post-independence period. It was a sort of transitional administration, and Mountbatten was a powerful figure, and if let's say the Indian Army made some plans, they were supposed to be executed by British commanders who were in communication with British commanders on the other side. So they were effectively neutralized. I mean, there's been a lot of polemic since. People who dislike Nehru say that people on the Indian right wing typically, they say that Nehru gave away half of Kashmir to Pakistan. He could have easily have sent in Indian troops and sort of vacated those territories. But given the situation then, that was not so easy. And 1948 was really a restrained conflict. And 1919 too was a kind of restrained conflict, because again, war between two countries who are nuclear powers immediately brings in the specter of international intervention, which limited that war. So 1965 and 71 were really the only two full-fledged wars which the two countries fought. And that phase is over, more or less. So nowadays it will be conflict will be much more in the realm of subconventional attacks, maybe surgical strikes, but unlikely to go beyond that. So anyway, apart from that detour, after the explosion of after the test, India and Pakistan entered a period of extreme brinkmanship, because there were the attacks on the Indian Parliament in 13 December 2001, Kargil war itself. Then India retaliated with Operation Parakram, which sort of led to a warlike situation between the two countries. But eventually it all dissipated, and 2004 the Islamabad Declaration was signed. And that initiated perhaps one of the best periods of India-Pakistan amity, till it was ended by 26/11. Now, what is the big difference between Indian and Pakistani views of Kashmir and India-Pakistan relation, the whole India-Pakistan relationship as such? The Pakistani view is mostly that Kashmir is the core dispute between India and Pakistan, and unless Kashmir is settled, the whole relationship is endangered and nothing can really move forward. And how do you settle Kashmir? You go back to the UN Security Council resolution of 1948, which called for a plebiscite in Kashmir. So have a plebiscite in Kashmir. And that's the core Pakistan position. Whereas the Indian position is that the plebiscite has been superseded by the Simla Accord of 1972, which said that any border disputes will be settled by bilateral and peaceful negotiations between India and Pakistan. And that was actually reiterated during the Islamabad Declaration of 2004. the Simla Accord said that neither side should attempt to alter the LOC between the two nations unilaterally, and both sides to settle their differences by peaceful means through bilateral negotiations. But from the Indian point of view, Pakistan has never stuck to these propositions. They have not stuck to peaceful means. They have not stuck to bilateral negotiations. They have carried on subconventional warfare, sometimes entering even the terrain of conventional warfare, as in Kargil. And the basic reason for that is, from the Pakistani point of view, Kashmir is only a way station. I mean, the real Pakistani problem with India is that its quest is to be the equal of India in every sense, which is almost impossible, because India is 6 times the population, 8 times the GDP. Six to 8 times the territory, arable land on territory. So that is really an impossible quest. And unless Pakistan gives up on that impossible quest, it's very difficult to have peace. Also, that Pakistan has this, or the Pakistani elite upholds this thesis, which is similar to the political philosopher Samuel Huntington, in the American political philosopher Samuel Huntington has this notion of clash of civilizations, which is that the world is divided into different civilizations who are in a sort of fundamental clash with each other, and but particularly the conflict with Islamic civilization can never be settled through peaceful means, or it's very difficult to settle it through peaceful means. It's Islamic civilization has bloody borders. That was Huntington's thesis everywhere in the world, and it seems from the Indian point of view that Pakistan has almost a similar view of the relationship between Pakistan and India, that there's an irreconcilable clash of civilizations between Pakistan and India. Between Hindu civilization, they see India as mostly Hindu civilization, and Islamic civilization. And this kind of point of view got strengthened in Pakistan following the advent of General Zia-ul-Haq and his Islamization program, which began from Zia-ul-Haq came to power in 1977, and the Islamization program started from 1978, and that has left to a kind of radicalization of Pakistani point of view. So Pakistan is really the revolutionary state in the subcontinent, whereas India is a status quo state. India is a status quo state because its principal objective is to expand its economy. It does not necessarily covet territory in Pakistan or China or anywhere. Whereas Pakistan is a revolutionary state, wants to expand itself. but the interesting thing was that after the 1999 Kargil war, the Indian thesis began to have more takers across the world, because what really alarmed the world was, Pakistan undertaking these adventurous exercises in a nuclear risk scenario, where it seemed almost that Pakistan was daring the world that here's this conflict and it's going to sort of become a nuclear scenario soon, where atomic bombs could be used. So the world had better intervene, and the world had better intervene to, as it were, scuttle the Simla Accord hypothesis that that India-Pakistan dispute should be settled bilaterally. Now, why did Pakistan think that if the world intervenes, it will be necessarily in on terms that Pakistan wanted? That part was perhaps not well thought through in Pakistan, because in fact the opposite happened, because the world thought Pakistan was being very adventurous, and soon after Bill Clinton came to India in 2000, and prior to coming to India, he stepped off in Islamabad, and he made a speech which the US stipulated should be carried live on Pakistani television. And in that speech, this was the famous "borders cannot be redrawn with blood" speech, which in a sense is in sync with the Indian position, that the LOC cannot be changed too much, or if there's going to be a settlement, it has to recognize the LOC. So to quote from that speech, Clinton said, "International sympathy, support and intervention cannot be won by provoking a larger, bloodier conflict." So there too, Clinton seems to take the Indian side, because I think the strategy behind the Kashmir insurgency has been all along that I don't think any of the insurgents believed that they could actually defeat the Indian army or displace it from Kashmir, but the idea was to have a sort of synergy of military and diplomatic efforts, where because of the legacy of the Cold War and where in India had a kind of Soviet-leaning non-alignment policy, and Pakistan leaned more towards the West. There could be concerted Western and international diplomatic pressure to be brought on India to cede Kashmir or have a plebiscite or whatever, do so in Pakistani terms. Yeah. So that became the Pakistani strategy was not that well thought through, and since then India-US relations have been on the upswing. Clinton made a subsequent visit to India, which was extremely successful, and which is generally seen as the big transformative event in India-US relations. Since then, they have mostly been on the upswing. So, to come to the present, there was yet civilian governments in Pakistan. Then in India, there was a big shift when Modi came to power in 2014. Actually, not so much of a big shift because immediately on coming to power, Modi made overtures. He at his inauguration ceremony, he invited Nawaz Sharif and all SAARC heads, and then in 2015 he made this sort of dramatic visit to Sharif's estate in Lahore. But that was almost immediately followed by the attack in Pathankot. So he didn't seem to find takers in. Actually, he and Sharif seem to have hit it off well, but Sharif may not have carried that much weight within the Pakistani establishment as far as its India policy is concerned. And later Sharif was deposed. One of the prime reasons Sharif was deposed may have been that he was seen as too friendly to India. So currently India is trying to diplomatically isolate Pakistan. It's not a policy that can be completely successful, but what India seems to be offering Pakistan now is that we can either talk or you can conduct subconventional warfare, but you can't really have both. You can't have a situation where we talk to each other, but you sort of punctuating those talks with making your points better with these terror attacks here and there. So you will need to choose which mode you want to engage India, which is a bit of a shift. In that sense, the current NDA position is a bit of a shift from the UPA position, where as Mani Shankar Iyer once formulated the UPA position, it was we should have uninterruptible talks, no matter what happens otherwise. We should continue talking, and eventually a solution will be found. So
well, thank you very much, Swagato, for what I think was more of a meditation than a lecture. I think we're all the wiser for it. For my students in particular, you notice he began theoretically. He set out two theoretical formulations. One was the Marxist position and one was the Mahabharata position. And then he added to that, he filled in the narrative, the theoretical positions that he put forward with the causal effects, the history of the relationship. So we are very much indebted for not only the fact that you told us a story which many of us know, but the way in which you told us the story, which is what is your contribution and adds to our knowledge. So before I allow you to turn it over to you for questions, I have, I think, one or two of my own. The first is, so what is the lesser impossibility? That we shall actually be able to burst forth from this blood enmity and manage to progress through history? And if that is possible, what kind of leaders do we need? Do we need a Musharraf who, as you may not know, Musharraf was born in India. He's a convert, as it were. There's a term for them in Pakistan, the ones from India who moved to Pakistan. And that made him radically anti-Indian, a Pakistani general who launched Kargil. But that also gave him the credibility to take the show forward. So do we need someone like that? And if we need someone like that on that side, what kind of person do we need on our side? And will history, in all its vagaries, ever be able to produce these things? Or can there be a system put in place to break us out of this? And the other question I'd like to...
No, that's an excellent question, actually. I mean, I don't really have a definite answer to that, but a lot of things can depend on personal chemistry between leaders. I mean, we are told that history is caused either by the actions of great leaders who inspire us to fight for freedom or whatever, or you know, there's another trend which says that it's called subaltern history, which says that history is really determined by movement of the little people, not kings and monarchs, who really determine history through their revolts when elites get too oppressive. But there could be a third explanation of things, which could be that history is determined neither by subalterns nor by great leaders, but some of the odd quirks that leaders have. For instance, all this bad blood between India and Pakistan may have been the consequence of bad blood between irascible personalities like Jinnah and Nehru. And even Gandhi rubbed Jinnah the wrong way on many occasions. There are historical occasions. There are historical record of that. So these leaders didn't get together, and ultimately that resulted in partition and bloodshed and so on. And perhaps if you have leaders of a different caliber, that's going to change. The whole problem is once these conflicts get going, it perhaps requires leadership of an enormously high quality on both sides, not just on one side. And one might argue that Modi tried to establish that kind of relationship with Sharif. And he did try the personal approach. But whether Sharif is the right man or maybe he should have approached the army chief. But that's something that we are loath to do. But China and America, they deal with the military chiefs in China, in Pakistan, when they want to get something done. Maybe we should attempt something like that. Maybe talk to them directly. Who knows?
Thank you. Do any of you have any? Yes, please.
Since China is actually like supporting Pakistan and all of that, so are we in a position of being like threatened, or are we going to face a threat in the future because of these relations between China and Pakistan?
Again, a great question, because you know this the China-Pakistan economic corridor is transforming the whole relationship, India, China, Pakistan, and creating a different matrix of possibilities, opportunities, threats altogether. I mean, from an Indian point of view, it is a threat because, for instance, one hears of plans of establishing Chinese townships in Gwadar. Then the Chinese could easily establish a naval base in Gwadar. Also, there are plans of developing a sort of financial city in Gwadar for which apparently even a gated Chinese township where only China. I mean, it's almost a return to colonial period, where only Chinese will be allowed to enter. But how far is that sustainable? One wonders. I mean, isn't that going to lead to a lot of resistance on the ground in Pakistan? I mean, Pakistani elite has this view of China, a very simplistic view in my opinion, that China is good, everything China does is good, everything India does is bad. By the way, there is enormous oppression of Muslims in China, which is slowly coming to light. So can Pakistan get away with talking about human rights violations in Kashmir, but not talk at all about what's happening in China, where it seems a million Uyghurs have been interned in sort of labor or re-education camps. So these camps have been detention camps have been almost abolished in China, but now they're back, and it's mostly it seems to cure Muslims of their religion. And at the same time, Pakistan is of course ground zero for Muslim radicals. And their CPEC will actually connect Xinjiang, which is where the Uyghurs are the majority population, and Pakistani territories. So China will have a problem sustaining this. That's the way it seems to me.
We'll take 2 or 3 and then we'll have.
So we come to hear that Pakistan is a very feudal setup, and there's a military feudal complex in Pakistan, and that is why it is very difficult for India, has been very difficult for India to negotiate that way. Do we see industrialization and CPEC leading to the breakdown of this feudal system in the future?
And why don't you ask your question as well?
Right now with Pakistan electing Imran Khan as its Prime Minister, there are lots of changes happening within Pakistan, including the CPEC and of course its India relations. I personally believe that Imran Khan is like a pseudo-Trump in Pakistan, because his own views of criticizing CPEC and also talking about peace talks in India are directly contrasting to what his party beliefs are, which are very, like, he's praised Taliban in the past himself. So how do you see PM Modi or our future Prime Minister navigating through this, where the Prime Minister doesn't really believe what he's advocating for?
Well, everybody wants peace. Nobody is going to say that they want war. They want so. But how do you get there? That is the question. And what are you willing to do in order to usher in peace, or have a situation that is more conducive to peaceful negotiations? And I, with Pakistan facing a lot of international opprobrium currently from the Trump administration, because the Trump, for the first time we have had a US administration that is tough on Pakistan. If one wants to take a cynical view, one could argue that Pakistan needs peace talks with India for its own sake, to break out of the isolation. It can say that we are negotiating with India, who's a prime opponent, rival, and so on. But what is it willing to concede? Can it sort of offer a stop, a cessation of terror attacks for the while talks take place? That would be what India is interested in. Uh, and we haven't seen anything in, as you said, Imran Khan also supports radicals in Pakistan. So there's been no sign of Imran Khan walking back from that as such. That is what India might look for given the current NDA position, as I outlined, which is different from the UPA position. And as to your question about whether CPEC will lead to the industrialization of Pakistan, that is the big question, really. Or the big question about this Belt and Road Initiative of China, whether it helps the countries where which it passes through, or do they incur debt traps, which then they have to. Is it almost like the situation of the village moneylender in India, where he lends you money and then expects it back with a lot of interest, and then you can't pay him, and then you sort of have to cede other things, maybe your wife or whatever. In Sri Lanka, the Chinese port project in Hambantota led to so much debt in Sri Lanka that eventually Hambantota had to be ceded on a 99-year-old lease to China. And incidentally, that one of the biggest economic problems in China currently is its debt is huge. It's both domestic and foreign debt is huge. So could BRI be a way of exporting that debt, as it were, sort of passing on the debt to other nations, so that China is relieved of the debt. If that is the case, then not much industrialization can be expected to happen from BRI. And actually, I have a piece in this book where I've debunked the notion that BRI is a kind of Marshall Plan. It works very differently from the Marshall Plan, which basically rejuvenated Europe after Europe was destroyed after the Second World War. One of the reasons it could get back on its feet was the Marshall Plan, which the US government extended. BRI is not the Marshall Plan; its principles are very different.
Let's say two more.
Sir, in his book, Graham Allison, there's a book by him called Destined for War, Can America and China Escape to Sidicus' Trap? He talks about the trap where he says that it was the rise of Athens and the fear that instilled in Sparta that made the war inevitable. Why I'm pointing out this is that I want to understand why do we see a bias towards pessimistic thinking when we want to invoke, serious analysis. So every time I read a book, it has to have certain explosive or radical kind of thought. Only then there's a thought about seriously analyzing the problem. Otherwise, like you mentioned about the conundrum of exploring the positive side of the India-Pakistan relation, nobody seemed to talk about that in much practice.
Professor, I had a question that I really like the analogy you made of India and Pakistan as like maybe Mahabharata as two sides of the similar lineage fighting against each other. But in the Mahabharata, they can come to an end with one side completely demolishing the other.
Yeah, but that's not possible nowadays because both countries are nuclear armed. So, in fact, that should settle a lot of Pakistani's insecurities regarding India, that India is going to take them over and so on. India cannot take them over now. I mean, it's possess a nuclear deterrent to conventional Indian attacks. So that actually should stabilize the situation, theoretically speaking, and but I have a feeling that, again to answer your question, that among the Pakistani civilians, there is not that much hostility towards India, and it is primarily a problem of the military establishment, the ISI, the army. So how to coax them into sort of better relations, that's which has a lot to do. And this was said by Frank Mores, who was a long time back in 1950s. He was editor of the Times of India in the 1950s, and his view was that India-Pakistan relations cannot be settled till Pakistan has a stable government. It works out a stable system of governance, which is a sort of internal problem for Pakistan as well. Because no democratically elected government lasts its full term. It's always deposed for some reason or the other. So internal dynamics of Pakistani politics may have a big role to play.
Swagato, I don't know how many Indian authors who write about India and Pakistan talk about making the line of control the de facto border, or helping Pakistan. I don't see that on our side either. We seem to be just as much involved in the enmities.
But I don't think we have a realistic aspiration of annexing Pakistan. It might be a negotiating position, as long as Pakistanis don't concede, we'll sort of claim this, so that ultimately you can have a modus vivendi. But realistically, interestingly, even RSS, the Indian right wing, has this notion of Akhand Bharat, where India would basically, we would annul partition essentially. But even they seem to have given up on that dream. Their current thinking might be, it seems that then they dislike Muslims, and there will be too many Muslims, and how will we handle them? That's from their point of view.
So, Pritish, I want to ask the last question, then we will wrap up.
Do you think there is a deep state at work in India too, as in Pakistan, which is pulling India back from initiating further dialogue with Pakistan?
Deep state, deep state in what sense?
Like, are there any non-state actors at work behind the curtains government working in India, which is also, anti-Pakistan, which is working, pulling?
That could be, but I think the civilian government in India has a lot more autonomy. It can. In that sense, the deep state works everywhere, in every country. But the civilian government in India does have a lot of autonomy. Even saying civilian government is a kind of tautology, because Indian government is a civilian government. Whereas you can't say the same for Pakistan. That's
Okay, we've run out of time. We've exceeded our time. So thank you very much for attending, and thank you very much, Mahabharat, for